Have you ever wondered how many secrets hide behind a white coat and a respectable title? In 2022, Singapore stood as a monument to order, efficiency, and moral clarity, a city-state where rules weren't suggestions but sacred commandments. But inside the pristine corridors of Mount Elizabeth Novena Hospital, where wealth and medicine intersected at $15,000 per night suites, Dr. Victor Tan was about to learn that some infections cannot be cured by money, reputation, or power. This isn't a story about a simple affair. It's about the systematic destruction of 3 lives, the exposure of a system built on silence, and the moment when one woman's truth became more powerful than an entire institution's lies. The morning sun cast geometric shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dr. Victor Tan's corner office on the hospital's executive floor. From this height, Singapore stretched out like a perfectly rendered architectural model. Marina Bay sands gleaming in the distance, the gardens by the bay creating organic curves against the rigid geometry of the financial district, and the endless parade of luxury vehicles moving with clockwork precision along Novena's arterial roads. Victor's office was a carefully curated statement of achievement. Medical degrees from National University of Singapore and Johns Hopkins lined one wall. Awards from the Ministry of Health occupied another. His mahogany desk, imported from Milan, held nothing but a slim laptop and a single photograph, his wedding portrait from 15 years ago, where he and his wife Michelle stood frozen in a moment of apparent perfection outside the Raffles Hotel. At 47, Dr. Victor Tan embodied everything Singaporean society valued: discipline, excellence, and uncompromising standards. His rise through Singapore's medical hierarchy had been meteoric and entirely predictable. Top of his class at medical school, youngest chief of surgery at Singapore General Hospital, and now, for the past 3 years, director of medical operations at Mount Elizabeth Novena, one of Southeast Asia's most prestigious private hospitals. His reputation extended beyond surgical skill into the realm of institutional legend. Hospital staff spoke of his morning rounds with a mixture of reverence and terror. He could identify protocol violations from across a ward, spot medication errors in patient charts with a single glance, and reduce careless nurses to tears with nothing more than a disappointed silence. His expectations were absolute, his standards unyielding, and his commitment to perfection was the invisible framework that held the entire hospital together. But perfection, as Victor would discover, is simply a mask worn long enough that everyone forgets there's a face beneath it. Michelle Tan, his wife of 15 years, was herself a monument to Singapore's educated elite. At 43, she directed the financial planning division at DBS Bank, managed a property portfolio worth over 8 million Singapore dollars, and maintained the kind of social calendar that served as both networking opportunity and status performance. Their 2 children, Ethan, 14, and Sophie, 11, attended Singapore American School, where quarterly fees exceeded most Singaporeans' annual salaries. The Tan family lived in a penthouse condominium in Ardmore Park, where units didn't have prices, only upon request listings that ensured only the appropriate class of buyer would inquire. Their household ran with the efficiency of a German automobile factory. Michelle managed schedules, finances, and social obligations with spreadsheets and automated reminders. Dinner was at 7:30 precisely. Family time occurred between 8:15 and 9:30 on designated evenings. Even intimacy, though neither would have admitted it, had become scheduled and perfunctory. Their marriage wasn't unhappy, exactly. It simply existed in that peculiar state of high-functioning disconnection that characterizes so many successful couples. They were excellent partners in the business of maintaining status and raising accomplished children. But somewhere between the medical conferences and banking seminars, between the country club dinners and charity galas, the actual emotional connection had been archived like old tax documents, technically preserved, but never actually accessed. Victor told himself this was normal. That passion was for young people who hadn't yet learned that sustainable success required discipline over feeling, that his increasing hours at the hospital were about professional responsibility, not avoidance, that the hollow sensation he felt watching his children grow into strangers was simply the price of providing them with every advantage. Then, on a humid Tuesday morning in March 2022, Isabella Reyes walked into his carefully ordered world and detonated 15 years of careful construction. Isabella had arrived at Mount Elizabeth Novena 3 months earlier, one of the hospital's quarterly intake of foreign nurses recruited to fill gaps in Singapore's healthcare workforce. At 29, she possessed the kind of beauty that existed before cosmetic intervention became normalized. Clear skin that held the warmth of Manila sunlight, dark eyes that suggested intelligence before kindness, and a professional demeanor that indicated she understood exactly how beauty functioned as both asset and liability in institutional hierarchies. Her credentials were impressive for someone of her background. Bachelor of Science in Nursing from University of Santo Tomas, top 10% of her graduating class, 3 years, experience in Manila's Cardinal Santos Medical Center's intensive care unit. The recruitment agency had flagged her application as premium placement, the kind of candidate who wouldn't just fill a position but elevate a department. What the recruitment files didn't capture was the desperation that had driven her from the Philippines. Isabella's father had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier, leaving him partially paralyzed and dependent on medications that consumed her entire Manila salary. Her mother worked as an elementary school teacher, earning barely enough to cover basic expenses. Isabella's 2 younger siblings were still in university, their education funded by loans that would take decades to repay. The Singapore contract represented salvation, monthly salary 4 times what she earned in Manila, tax-free income that could be sent home entirely, and most importantly, escape from a romantic situation that had become suffocating. Her ex-boyfriend, a doctor at Cardinal Santos, had responded to their breakup with the kind of obsessive pursuit that made her consider filing legal protection orders. Singapore offered 10,000 kilometers of safety. But Singapore also offered isolation. The efficiency apartment she shared with 3 other Filipina nurses in Balestier was a study in compressed existence. Bunk beds, shared bathroom schedules, and kitchen access negotiated through a rotating calendar. Her days off were spent at Lucky Plaza, the shopping center that functioned as Manila's unofficial Singapore embassy, where she could eat sisig, hear Tagalog, and briefly pretend she was home. The work itself was demanding in ways that transcended the physical exhaustion of 12-hour shifts. Singapore's medical system operated with an intensity that made Manila's pace seem leisurely. Everything was protocol-driven, documentation-obsessed, and subject to metrics that measured efficiency down to the minute. The hospital's Singaporean staff maintained a polite but firm distance from foreign nurses, a social boundary that made clear who held permanent belonging and who remained temporary labor. Isabella navigated this landscape with strategic precision. She volunteered for the most challenging shifts, learned every protocol before being asked, and maintained a professional warmth that made patients feel cared for without ever crossing into overfamiliarity. Within 2 months, she had earned reputation as someone who could be trusted with the hospital's most demanding patients and complicated procedures. It was this reputation that brought her into Dr. Victor Tan's orbit. The first time he truly noticed her wasn't during rounds or in passing through hospital corridors. It was at 2:15 in the morning in the cardiac ICU, where Isabella was managing 3 critical patients with the kind of calm competence that seemed impossible given the chaos of alarms, concerned family members, and the ever-present threat of medical emergency. Victor had been called in for a consultation on a VIP patient, a minister's brother experiencing complications following bypass surgery. He arrived expecting to find the usual night shift confusion, and instead encountered Isabella orchestrating the ward with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. She had anticipated his questions before he asked them, prepared documentation before he requested it, and demonstrated a clinical understanding that exceeded many senior nurses. "You're new," he said, not quite a question, as she handed him the patient's updated charts. 3 months, sir, Isabella replied, maintaining the respectful distance that Singapore's medical hierarchy demanded. "Your assessment of the fluid accumulation," he tested her, expecting hesitation or deflection. Instead, she provided a concise analysis that aligned exactly with his own preliminary conclusions. complete with suggested modifications to the medication regimen that showed she understood not just procedures, but underlying physiology. For the first time in months, Victor felt something beyond the numbing routine of professional obligation. Here was someone who spoke his language, who understood excellence not as aspiration but as baseline expectation. That initial interaction established a pattern. Victor began timing his night consultations to coincide with Isabella's shifts. He requested her specifically for complex procedures, justifying it as resource optimization. Why not pair the hospital's best surgeon with its most competent ICU nurse? The other nurses noticed but said nothing. In Singapore's hierarchical medical culture, directors' preferences were simply accepted as natural order. Their conversations, initially confined to patient care, gradually expanded. Victor would linger after rounds, asking her opinion on administrative challenges. Isabella, recognizing opportunity when it presented itself, offered insights shaped by her Manila experience, practical solutions that came from working in resource-constrained environments where improvisation was necessary for survival. He found himself looking forward to these exchanges with an anticipation that felt almost adolescent. Michel's conversations had devolved into logistics and status updates. His children communicated primarily through monosyllables. But Isabella listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions, and seemed to value his thoughts beyond their utility for her own advancement. For Isabella, the attention from someone of Victor's position was both validation and strategic asset. In the Philippines, she had been just another competent nurse in an oversaturated market. Here, recognition from the hospital's director opened possibilities: better shift assignments, recommendation letters that could lead to permanent residency, and most practically, protection from the petty cruelties that foreign workers often endured. She told herself this was professional relationship building, networking that any ambitious person would cultivate. That her careful attention to his preferences, the way he took his coffee during night shifts, his frustration with bureaucratic inefficiency, his pride in his daughter's piano accomplishments, was simply good career strategy. The first boundary violation was so subtle that both could pretend it hadn't happened. It occurred in early June, during one of Singapore's sudden afternoon thunderstorms that transformed the city into a blurred watercolor. Victor and Isabella found themselves alone in his office, reviewing quarterly patient satisfaction metrics. A meeting that had no clear reason to involve an ICU nurse, but that neither questioned. As rain hammered against the windows, creating a cocoon of white noise that isolated them from the hospital's usual soundtrack, their conversation drifted from professional to personal. Victor mentioned his wedding anniversary approaching, the observation carrying an undertone of weary obligation rather than celebration. Isabella responded with a carefully calibrated comment about the complexity of maintaining relationships across cultural and professional pressures. The moment their eyes held a fraction longer than professional courtesy allowed, something shifted. No words acknowledged it. No physical contact occurred. But both understood that a line had been approached and that the decision to cross it was no longer theoretical but inevitable. 3 weeks later, Victor arranged for Isabella to attend a weekend medical conference in Johor Bahru, just across the border in Malaysia. The official justification was professional development for high-performing staff. The reality was that hotel reservations had been made, and the pretense of separate rooms lasted exactly as long as it took to check in. What followed wasn't the explosive passion of movie romances, but something more dangerous: the discovery of emotional intimacy that both had been starving for without realizing it. In that hotel room, with Malaysia's looser social atmosphere providing temporary freedom from Singapore's judgmental gaze, they became versions of themselves that their regular lives had forbidden. Victor wasn't the demanding director whose disapproval could end careers. He was simply a man in his late 40s who remembered what it felt like to be genuinely seen by another person. Isabella wasn't the grateful foreign worker managing power differentials with strategic compliance. She was someone whose intelligence and ambitions extended beyond survival into actual self-actualization. They talked through the night with an intensity that felt almost narcotic. Victor described the suffocation of expectations that had defined his entire life. The pressure to be perfect son, perfect student, perfect doctor, perfect husband. Isabella shared the guilt of leaving her family, the peculiar loneliness of being perpetually foreign, and the exhaustion of performing competence while constantly uncertain of her position. The physical relationship, when it finally occurred as dawn was breaking over Malaysia, felt almost incidental to the emotional connection they'd established. But it sealed something between them that would prove impossible to break. They returned to Singapore on Sunday evening, separately and via different transportation, maintaining the careful compartmentalization that affairs require. But something fundamental had changed. They now carried a shared secret that was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. Over the following months, the affair developed the rhythms and rituals that characterize hidden relationships. They met in carefully selected locations, hotels across the border, Victor's private office after hours, and once, in a moment of reckless confidence, Isabella's shared apartment when her roommates were all on night shifts. Victor justified the deception with an evolving narrative. His marriage had been dead for years. Michelle cared only about status and finances. He deserved happiness after decades of sacrifice. Isabella represented authenticity in a world of performance. Isabella's justifications were more pragmatic but equally self-serving. Victor could facilitate her permanent residency application. His connections extended throughout Singapore's medical establishment. And honestly, after years of struggling, didn't she deserve something for herself? Not just someone who could help her family, but who actually valued her as more than an economic asset. Neither acknowledged what they both understood, that their relationship existed in a bubble that could never survive contact with reality, that the power differential made genuine equality impossible, that the secrecy that made their connection feel special was also what made it fundamentally corrupted. The cracks began appearing in August. Michelle, whose financial intelligence extended to pattern recognition, noticed irregularities in their credit card statements. Hotel charges in Johor Bahru during a weekend when Victor claimed to be attending a medical conference in Singapore. Restaurant expenses that didn't correspond with his documented schedule. Individually, these were easily explained. Collectively, they suggested something more systematic. She didn't confront him directly. Michelle's approach to problems was methodical and evidence-based. Instead, she hired a private investigator, a former police officer who specialized in matrimonial cases and who understood that Singapore's wealthy required discretion above all else. The investigator's report, delivered 3 weeks later in a sealed manila envelope, contained everything Michelle needed. Photographs of Victor and Isabella entering hotels, time-stamped evidence of their meetings, text message metadata showing communication patterns that extended well beyond professional necessity. Most damning of all, financial analysis showing that Victor had opened a separate bank account and had been transferring funds that corresponded with Isabella's rent payments. Michelle read the report in her office at DBS, her expression never changing from the focused concentration she showed during client presentations. She had built her career on never revealing emotion during negotiations, and this would be no different. The betrayal hurt less than she expected. Perhaps their emotional divorce had been more complete than she'd realized, but the public humiliation of being the wronged wife would be intolerable. She began strategic planning. Divorce in Singapore's elite circles required careful choreography. Assets needed protecting. Children's reputations required management. Most importantly, she needed leverage to ensure the split happened on her terms. While Michelle gathered evidence, Isabella was discovering something that would transform the entire situation from private betrayal into public catastrophe. The symptoms began subtly. A persistent fever that refused to respond to over-the-counter medication, exhaustion that went beyond the usual fatigue of hospital work, and night sweats that left her sheets soaked and cold by morning. She initially dismissed these as stress manifestations or perhaps dengue fever, common enough in Singapore's tropical climate. But when the fever persisted for 3 weeks and lymph nodes in her neck swelled visibly, professional instinct overrode personal denial. She scheduled an appointment at a public clinic, deliberately avoiding Mount Elizabeth Novena where colleagues might ask questions. The doctor who saw her was thorough and methodical, working through differential diagnoses with the careful attention that Singapore's medical system demanded. When he suggested an HIV test among the battery of blood work, Isabella felt her stomach drop with a fear that transcended rational assessment. "It's just routine screening," the doctor assured her, misreading her expression as general anxiety. "With your symptoms, we want to rule out everything." The 3 days waiting for results were an exercise in sustained terror. Isabella found herself researching HIV transmission rates, reviewing every sexual encounter of the past 5 years, and calculating probabilities with the desperate focus of someone hoping mathematics might change biology. Her ex-boyfriend in Manila had been her only partner before Victor. They'd used protection inconsistently, but he was a doctor. Surely he would have known if he was positive. Surely he would have told her. Unless he didn't know. Unless he'd been with someone else who'd been with someone else in the endless chain of risk that characterized human sexual behavior. Victor had been careful about protection initially, but as their relationship deepened and comfort replaced caution, they'd stopped. He was married, monogamous as far as she knew, and they'd both treated the relationship as effectively exclusive. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. The clinic requested she come in person to discuss her results. Never a good sign. Isabella knew enough about medical protocols to understand that negative results were typically delivered over the phone. The doctor's expression, when she entered the consultation room, confirmed her worst fears before he spoke. "Ms. Reyes, I'm very sorry, but your HIV test came back positive." The words seemed to arrive from a great distance, filtered through water or thick glass. Isabella heard herself asking questions about CD4 counts, viral loads, treatment options, her professional training providing a cognitive framework that kept her from completely dissociating. "We've caught it relatively early," the doctor continued, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "Your CD4 count is 450, which means your immune system is still functional. We can start antiretroviral therapy immediately, and with consistent treatment, you can expect to live a normal lifespan." Normal, the word felt like a cruel joke. There was nothing normal about being HIV positive, especially not in Singapore where she existed on a work visa that could be canceled the moment authorities learned of her status. There was nothing normal about having to tell Victor that she'd either infected him or he'd infected her. The question of transmission direction consumed her thoughts with obsessive intensity. The public health nurse who counseled her after the diagnosis explained that without testing Victor, there was no way to determine who had been the original source. But Isabella found herself mentally cataloging every symptom, every timeline, trying to construct a narrative that would make her the victim rather than the vector. She needed to tell Victor. Medical ethics and basic human decency demanded it. But the implications terrified her beyond the disease itself. Would he blame her? Accuse her of deliberately infecting him? Would he use his position to have her deported, erasing the problem along with her presence? For 2 weeks, Isabella said nothing. She started antiretroviral therapy, picking up her medications from the public clinic, and hiding them in her apartment behind tampons and toiletries where her roommates would never look. She continued working her shifts, maintaining her professional mask while internally spiraling. But secrets, especially medical secrets, have a way of asserting themselves. It was Isabella's roommate, Maria, who first noticed the medication bottles. Sharing a bathroom meant that privacy was theoretical rather than actual, and Maria had inadvertently seen the distinctive labeling on Isabella's prescription bottles. Maria's reaction wasn't judgmental but worried. She, Dee, worked in HIV wards in Manila and understood both the medical realities and social stigmas. "Bella, you need to tell them at the hospital. You're working with patients. There are protocols." "If I tell them, they'll fire me," Isabella said, the fear making her voice rough. "They'll send me home. My family depends on this income." "And if you infect someone, if there's a needle stick, if someone's blood gets on you during a procedure," Maria's logic was irrefutable. "This isn't just about you anymore." But it wasn't just about medical ethics either. It was about the affair, the power differential, the systemic exploitation that had brought her to this moment. Every decision Isabella made was constrained by the reality that she was foreign, temporary, and expendable. The decision to tell Victor was made not from courage but desperation. Her viral load results came back showing significant levels despite treatment, a sign that the infection was relatively recent and possibly still contagious before therapy took full effect. The possibility that she'd exposed Victor, that he'd exposed his wife, that the chain of transmission could extend beyond their private sin into genuine public health crisis, made silence impossible. She requested a meeting with Victor, framing it as urgent and personal. He agreed immediately, assuming it related to their relationship status. Perhaps Isabella was developing feelings beyond what their arrangement permitted, or maybe she wanted more financial support. They met at a hotel in Jailang, one of Singapore's red-light districts where discretion was guaranteed and questions weren't asked. Victor arrived with the relaxed confidence of someone anticipating a familiar encounter. Isabella's expression stopped him before he could even remove his jacket. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "And you need to sit down." What she told him over the next 15 minutes destroyed his world, as completely as the diagnosis had destroyed hers. Victor's first response was denial, immediate and instinctive. "That's impossible. I'm tested regularly. All senior medical staff undergo annual health screenings." "When was your last comprehensive test?" Isabella asked, and watched realization spread across his face. The hospital's executive health screenings were thorough but bureaucratic. HIV testing wasn't automatically included unless specifically requested, a legacy of Singapore's early AIDS crisis when testing required counseling and consent. Victor, confident in his monogamy and status, had never thought to request it. "Who else have you been with?" His voice turned accusatory, seeking to shift the narrative toward Isabella as source rather than shared victim. "You," Isabella said flatly. "Only you since I arrived in Singapore, and one person before who was also a doctor who claimed to be clean." The mathematics of transmission were cruel and imprecise. Either Victor had been carrying the virus from a previous encounter, a possibility that seemed impossible given his marriage and professional obsession, or Isabella had been infected before their relationship and hadn't known until symptoms appeared. Without historical testing, blame would forever remain uncertain. "You need to get tested," Isabella continued, her nursing training asserting itself over emotional chaos. "Immediately, and you need to tell your wife. If you've been exposed, she's been exposed." The implications hit Victor in waves. The disease itself, the revelation of his affair to Michelle, the potential scandal if his HIV status became known at the hospital, the destruction of his reputation, his career, his entire carefully constructed life. "How long have you known?" he asked, latching onto the one detail where fault could potentially be assigned. 2 weeks. I needed time to process, to start treatment, to understand what this means." 2 weeks, his voice rose with anger and panic. "You've known for 2 weeks and you're just telling me now? We've been together since then. We had sex 3 days ago. You've been deliberately exposing me." "You exposed me," Isabella's composure finally cracked. "You're the one with a wife. You're the one who has access to health care and testing that I don't. You're the one who pursued this relationship using your position as leverage. And now you want to make me the villain because I took 2 weeks to figure out how to tell you without getting deported." The fight that followed was vicious and recursive, each accusing the other of primary responsibility, neither able to definitively prove transmission direction. Victor threatened to report her to the Ministry of Health. Isabella threatened to report their relationship to the hospital board and his wife. They were two drowning people trying to save themselves by pushing the other underwater. Finally, exhausted and terrified, they reached a grim agreement. Victor would get tested immediately, using a private clinic outside the Mount Elizabeth system. Depending on his results, they would determine next steps. If he was positive, he would tell Michelle, citing some ambiguous exposure without mentioning Isabella. If he was negative, they would end their relationship immediately and never speak of it again. But the virus, like all secrets that embed themselves in human tissue, wasn't interested in their negotiations. Victor's test results came back 5 days later. Positive, recent infection based on antibody progression. His CD4 count was still healthy, but viral load indicated he'd been infected within the past 6 months. He sat in his car in the clinic parking lot, results printed on paper that seemed to burn his hands, and understood that his life as he knew it was over. Not ended by the virus itself, modern treatment meant HIV was manageable, not fatal, but by the revelation of how he'd contracted it. He had 3 choices, each more devastating than the last. Tell Michelle the full truth about the affair and potential exposure. Tell her a partial truth that protected Isabella but implicated himself. Or say nothing and hope that Michelle never got tested, never showed symptoms, never discovered the ticking biological bomb he'd planted in their marriage. The decision was taken from him 2 days later, when Michelle arrived at his office with the private investigator's report and a lawyer's business card. "I know about your girlfriend," she said without preamble, standing before his desk like a prosecutor delivering opening arguments. "I know about the hotels, the money, the whole sordid thing. I'm filing for divorce, and you're going to agree to every term I set, or this goes public in ways that will destroy you professionally as well as personally." Victor looked at his wife, at the cold fury in her eyes, and understood that his life was bifurcating into before and after this moment. He could let her divorce him quietly, accepting financial devastation to preserve some remnants of reputation. Or he could tell her the truth and watch everything burn. The decision made itself through the simple weight of moral obligation. However much he'd failed as a husband and professional, he couldn't knowingly let Michelle walk away potentially infected and unaware. "Before you file anything," he said, his voice stripped of authority, "there's something else you need to know, something that changes everything." What he told her over the next 30 minutes accomplished something remarkable. It united them in horror that transcended their dying marriage. Michelle's fury transformed into ice-cold strategic thinking as she grasped the full implications. Her own HIV test came back negative, a small mercy that felt almost cruel given the larger disaster. She hadn't been infected, but only because their marital intimacy had become so infrequent that transmission hadn't occurred during Victor's infectious window. The legal strategy that Michelle's lawyer developed was ruthless and comprehensive. Victor would resign from Mount Elizabeth Novena, citing family health issues that required his full attention. He would accept a divorce settlement that left him with minimal assets but protected the children from scandal. Most importantly, he would sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented him from discussing the circumstances with anyone outside their legal team. Isabella's fate was addressed with bureaucratic efficiency. Michelle's lawyer contacted the Ministry of Manpower with information about a foreign worker who had violated her employment pass conditions by engaging in personal relationships with hospital staff. No mention was made of HIV. That would have created too many questions, but the relationship violation alone was sufficient grounds for pass cancellation. 3 weeks after Isabella revealed her diagnosis, she received a formal letter from the Ministry of Manpower. Her work pass was being revoked effective immediately. She had 72 hours to settle her affairs and leave Singapore. The deportation happened with the brutal efficiency that characterized all of Singapore's immigration enforcement. Isabella was escorted to the airport by immigration officers, her possessions fitting into 2 suitcases that represented 18 months of her life in Singapore. Her roommates had already been questioned about what they knew, creating a cloud of suspicion that followed every Filipina nurse in their social network. The flight back to Manila was a journey through compressed grief. Isabella was returning to the same economic desperation that had driven her away, but now carrying a diagnosis that would make employment in Philippine healthcare nearly impossible. The stigma around HIV remained intense in Manila, and medical facilities routinely dismissed positive employees despite anti-discrimination laws. Her family's reaction was complex. Her mother's Catholicism made her see the diagnosis as divine punishment. Her father's practical nature made him worry about treatment costs, and her siblings simply didn't know how to talk about something that existed outside their understanding of the world. Isabella found work eventually, but not in nursing. She took a position with an NGO that provided HIV education and support services, turning her diagnosis into the only credential that mattered more than her revoked nursing license. The work paid a fraction of her Singapore salary, but it offered something she'd never had before: a community of people who understood what it meant to carry the virus in a society that treated it as moral failing rather than medical condition. In Singapore, the ripples continued spreading. Dr. Victor Tan's resignation made minor news in medical circles, successful director stepping down for personal reasons, the kind of story that generated brief speculation before being forgotten. Only a handful of people knew the real story, bound by legal agreements and mutual self-interest to maintain silence. Michelle rebuilt her life with the same methodical precision she applied to financial planning. The divorce settlement left her with the majority of assets, full custody of the children, and most importantly, a narrative of being the innocent party wronged by her husband's weakness. She never remarried, but developed a reputation as someone who had handled crisis with grace and discretion. Victor moved to Australia, where his medical credentials still carried weight, but where his history was unknown. He established a small general practice in suburban Melbourne, treating routine ailments and carefully avoiding any situation that might require explaining why he'd left a director position in Singapore. His HIV status was managed with daily medication and quarterly checkups, a chronic condition that required vigilance but no longer defined his entire existence. The children, now young adults, maintained minimal contact with their father. Sophie had internalized her mother's version of events, that Victor had been unfaithful and selfish, destroying their family for momentary pleasure. Ethan, older and more cynical, suspected there were layers to the story that neither parent was sharing, but never pushed hard enough to discover the complete truth. The system that had enabled the entire tragedy remained largely unchanged. Foreign healthcare workers continued arriving in Singapore under employment passes that made them perpetually temporary and vulnerable. Power differentials between directors and staff nurses remained unquestioned, and the culture of silence around HIV persisted, ensuring that stories like Isabella's and Victor's stayed hidden beneath layers of shame and stigma. 3 years after the deportation, Isabella received an unexpected message through her NGO's contact form. It was from Maria, her former roommate, who had eventually returned to the Philippines after her own work pass ended. Maria had tracked Isabella down to deliver a message she felt obligated to share. "There were others," Maria wrote. "After you left, we heard rumors, other nurses who had relationships with him, at least 2 more that we knew of, maybe more. Nobody talked about it publicly because they were afraid of losing their passes. But your situation wasn't unique. He had a pattern." The revelation reframed everything. Isabella had spent 3 years believing she'd been special, that their connection had been unique, that the tragedy was somehow balanced by the authenticity of what they'd shared. Now she understood she'd been simply another iteration in a cycle of exploitation that Victor had refined over years. The question of HIV transmission remained forever unanswered. Had Victor been carrying the virus from a previous affair and infected Isabella? Had Isabella been infected by her ex-boyfriend in Manila and passed it to Victor? Or had there been another source entirely, someone else in the chain of transmission that extended beyond their limited perspective? Medical science could provide viral genotyping that might have answered these questions, but neither Isabella nor Victor had any interest in pursuing such investigation. What would it change? Who would it help? The virus had become simply another fact of their existence, like fingerprints or blood type, a characteristic that shaped their lives but no longer defined their entire identity. The larger questions raised by their story remain disturbingly relevant. How many relationships in positions of power follow similar patterns? Exploitation disguised as affection, strategic vulnerability mistaken for authentic connection. How many foreign workers in Singapore and elsewhere navigate the impossible choice between economic survival and personal dignity? How many institutions maintain cultures of silence that protect predators and punish victims? Singapore continued projecting its image of efficiency and moral clarity to the world. But in the gaps between the gleaming towers and efficient systems, other stories like Isabella's and Victor's played out in quiet desperation. Other affairs bloomed in the spaces where power and vulnerability intersected. Other diagnoses arrived like bombs in carefully ordered lives. Today, Isabella works as a program director for an HIV advocacy organization in Manila. She speaks publicly about her diagnosis and the circumstances that led to it, though she carefully avoids identifying details that might expose the others involved. Her story has become a cautionary tale in HIV prevention workshops and a rallying point for advocacy around foreign workers' rights. Victor continues practicing medicine in Melbourne, a competent but unremarkable GP whose past remains carefully compartmentalized from his present. He takes his antiretroviral medications each morning, a ritual reminder of choices that seemed rational at the time, but revealed themselves as catastrophic in retrospect. They have not spoken since that final meeting in the Jelang Hotel, where Isabella revealed her diagnosis. There is nothing left to say that hasn't been said, no reconciliation that would change the fundamental reality of what occurred between them. The prescription for their destruction was written not by any single decision, but by a system that created conditions where such destruction became inevitable. A medical hierarchy that ensured power flowed only downward. An immigration system that made vulnerability a permanent condition for foreign workers. A culture of silence that prioritized reputation over accountability. And two people who convinced themselves that their connection existed outside these systems, that their relationship was somehow exempt from the rules that governed everyone else. In the end, they discovered what countless others have learned before them and will learn again, that we are never as special as we believe, that systems are more powerful than individuals, and that secrets embedded in human tissue will eventually make themselves known regardless of how carefully we construct our lies. The virus continues replicating in both their bodies, managed but never eliminated, a biological reminder of the moment when desire collided with consequence and destroyed the illusion that reputation could protect against the fundamental vulnerabilities of being human.